Welcome to this episode of the Biz for Biz Webections podcast, and I'm delighted to welcome Andrew Watkin, who is going to talk us through what it takes to sell your business. Delighted to have Andrew with us, who operates under Ascent Corporate Finance. He assists businesses owners with the sale, restructuring, succession planning of their companies. As we know, all business owners have to exit their business at some point. Whether in whichever fashion. Andrew sees his mission to help business owners to realize sufficient monies from the sale of their business to meet their planned retirement needs, which are often left a bit late. He focuses on providing guidance to increase the probability of receiving an offer for your business and to maximize the value of it, whether through an outright sale, management buyout, or employee ownership trust. His expertise over many years includes preparing businesses for sale, navigating tax and financial intricacies, and ensuring a smooth transaction tailored to the owner's personal and financial goals. So, Andrew, great to have you with us today. Hopefully my introduction did you justice, and have I missed anything?
No, I don't think you have, Ian. Thank you very much for that introduction. I think it was very succinct, and particularly for inviting me to take part in this podcast, What It Takes to Sell Your Business.
Yeah, great, Andrew. And I guess we'll kick off straight into it, but I have a very quite broad question to start with. So, what type of business do you generally engage with, and what are the attributes of that business that make it possible to undertake a sales side process?
The businesses that I prefer to work with are what I would call traditional businesses. Now, they can be people like distributors, they can be manufacturers, they can be professional firms such as estate agents, accountants, or solicitors. The key, though, I think, from my point of view, because I have dealt with businesses in the construction sector, is that the revenue recognition is simple. In other words, if I sell you this phone, then the revenue is recognized at that point. If you have a contract, say, to fit out air conditioning in a building, then that might go over your year end. And it's the measurement of that, the valuation of that, which needs to be consistent. Otherwise, if you're playing around with that in order to either increase profits or reduce profits to pay less tax, then during the course of the buyer's due diligence, that is going to come out and could well affect the value that they place upon your business. I think the attributes that I tend to see for successful businesses is where the owner is devolved from the day-to-day running of the business. One of the questions I ask owners is what would happen if you were away for a month, if you were away for 2 months, if you were away for 3 months? What would happen to your business? And if you can't be confident that the business can survive while you're away, then do you really have a business to sell as opposed to selling you with your business, as opposed to selling the business without you? So I think in the case of a trade sale, whether that be to private equity or to a competitor or someone within your industry, I think you're probably looking at turnover of at least 1 million, because that way the chances are you're going to have a management team in place, and private equity and buyers are coming back to me saying, we're not really interested, Andrew, in the businesses where the profit, at least for the last 2 years, is something in the region of 350 to 500,000. So the keen buyers out there are looking for those type of businesses. Now, that's not to say that you can't sell a smaller business, but it might be more difficult finding a buyer who's prepared to pay the type of value that you may well expect to receive.
Yeah, and I think one of the areas is, in your view, how many businesses are ready for sale when they approach you, and if not ready, why not?
I'll be frank, Ian, that the ones that approach me, there are very few that are ready for sale.
Hmm.
Various reasons. I've hinted on the owner's devolvement from the day-to-day running of the business, I'd probably put that at top of the list.
Yeah.
I think if a buyer in your industry is looking at your business and you don't have recurring revenue, that isn't necessarily a problem to that business. But where they see a business where the buyer suddenly says, I've had enough, sorry, the seller says, I've had enough, I want
Yeah.
out,
Yeah.
and there's been no succession planning or no consideration of the value of the business and what drives to that value and what the buyers are going to be looking for, then that becomes the problem as to why the businesses aren't ready when the owner decides, I've had enough, I want out. That is probably too late.
Yeah. Well, that brings me on to the next question because, I suppose how long is a piece of string, as they say, but, listening to you list out some of the attributes earlier, what do you believe are the key areas as management team need to address, and how far ahead should they start the process? How long does it normally take to prepare a sale for a business for sale?
I think if you're starting from scratch and you need to build a management team, then you're probably looking at 2 to 3 years because
Mm.
A, you need to build it, and B, you need to prove that it's working.
Yeah.
And you can't build it quickly and then go to a buyer and say, oh, I've got a management team in place and it's only been operating for 6 months. It needs to have been operating for a longer period of time to prove that it is delivering on a business plan.
Mm.
In particular, they have formal meetings to review the results against that business plan. Have we done better? Have we done worse? Why? And ideally have some form of record of that meeting so that the buyer knows it's taking place and he's
Mm.
looking at something that's already constructed. He doesn't have to, or she doesn't have to construct a management team, particularly if you have a buyer that is looking to buy your business to fit into theirs,
Yeah.
as opposed to a buyer, what I would call a revenue buyer, who is just looking to buy your turnover. Because arguably, a management team doesn't really matter because they just want your turnover and will probably make everyone redundant soon after completion, no matter what they say. So again, the management team probably needs to reflect. If you haven't got one,
Yeah.
you've got a problem, whoever the buyer is. But
Yeah.
if you have one, particularly with a niche buyer who's looking to buy your bit to fit into his jigsaw, then the management team is crucial because the buyer doesn't have the expertise that your management team has. Ideally, I think you need a pyramidal structure
That's
rather than a
interesting.
flat structure because that
Yeah.
shows you've got the reporting lines coming up
Yeah.
in areas of where people's roles are and responsibilities are and where the procedures are. And I think really, ideally, you want the managers singing off the same hymn sheet.
Mm.
All of this, I don't underestimate it, is easier said than done.
Yeah.
But I think either way, you need to prove to a buyer to get them interested and make a decent offer that the management team is in place and is working.
And I think that while you're talking, it's going through my head. This is where sometimes, depending on the size of the business, a non-exec director might come in useful, rather than say a business coach or a leadership coach or anyone like that. Someone with some real business experience, and you often describe yourself as whilst not being a non-exec, but being like a non-exec director to help guide them through the business journey, which, as you say, needs to start several years ahead. Can you expand on that thought process for me?
Yeah, yeah, certainly. I think it's just essentially the role is trying to identify the areas which are reducing the value of the business
Hmm.
and not making it attractive to a seller. I think where it starts is to probably undertake a self-assessment. Uh, One of the things I did in the past life was being a governor and chair of governor of a school.
Hmm.
And that's a very regimented system of accountability and identifying areas and sorting those areas out. And in a way, that discipline is quite good for businesses. So, like a governor of a school, it's putting your nose in but keeping your fingers out. Because, for example, if we identify that the marketing funnel, the CRM system is weak, the website isn't working, uh, or whatever, then I don't know how to fix that, but I can introduce to a seller people that I know and trust that can put that in place. Now
Yeah.
that's not going to happen overnight. And that what I tend to say is, look, if we've identified, let's say, four areas that need to be improved, whether it be marketing, whether it be accounting, whether it be HR, whatever, you can't do them all in one go.
No.
You've got to say, okay, it's going to take 6 months to sort this out, 6 months to sort that out. So if you've got four areas, I think you're talking 2 years
Mm.
to get it in place. And going back to what we said about the management, maybe that's the first bit to attack. Because if they're in place after 6 months and it's working, you've then got 18 months plus that you can prove to a buyer that it is actually working.
Yeah.
So I think the thing is that you have the thing about a non-executive, a bit like a governor of a school, they're there to be a critical friend.
Yeah.
No one wants this to fail. But having said that, what you try and do is to get the owner to think, well, have you thought about this? Um, and get them to ask themselves questions that they otherwise wouldn't. And having an external person that probably isn't deeply involved in the business and doesn't put their fingers in,
Yeah.
because like a governor, you can't go and teach as you're not qualified for a start. Um, that you're looking at, you have to understand what's going on so that you can ask the fundamental questions and get the seller or the owner to sit back and say, yeah, he's got a point here.
Mm.
Maybe I should look at that. So it's very much that being a critical friend, identifying the areas where the business is weak and a buyer is going to be put off by them, and putting those in place over a period of, it might be 1 year, it might be 2 years, it might be 3 years, depending on the number and the depth of the particular problem.
Yeah. So having hopefully been engaged a few years earlier with a management team or an owner that has decided that actually his exit is at some point in the next few years, having got the business fit for sale, shall we say, in that process. And let's now look at the transaction itself. What levels of engagement do you offer to the business? Once we've got to that point, what's the next steps?
I'm not a control freak, but what I see too many owners starting off having discussions with potential buyers and starting to say things as to value, which makes it really difficult then to tread back. So, what I like to do is to talk to someone very early on. And if they've decided, yes, the time is now right to start marketing the business, what I can do is carry out some research as to who a likely buyer might be. Now, to do that, I can use the researchers at the Corporate Finance Network.
Hmm.
They use Mark to Market that you may have heard of. They use PitchBook, and they have their own database of accountants and that have businesses for sale and have buyers. So that process can take 2 to 6 weeks. While that's going on, we probably need to prepare, which is quite a difficult document to do, what I call a one pager, a teaser, a flyer. It probably goes over a page, but what it has to do is to get the essential parts of the business on an anonymized basis on a one piece of paper that's going to make that potential buyer pick up the phone and say, Andrew, can you tell me more about this business? It's
Hmm.
not going to sell the business. It doesn't have to be flashy. In fact, personally, I think the less flashy, the better, because if if they stop reading it after the second line, you've finished.
Yeah, exactly.
And probably a lot of buyers will see these quite regularly. So it's got to be really punchy. And at this point, you're starting now to control the flow of information. Whereas if the seller's had meetings with a buyer and then comes back to me and said, I've spoken to Fred, he's going to make an offer for my business, Andrew, can you help me? I'll run with that, but we've sort of lost control.
Yeah.
We've lost control of the information flow. If then a buyer comes along and says, Andrew, yeah, I'm interested in this business. Can I have some more information? We then have what's called a confidential information memorandum. And that does disclose a lot about the business. It discloses details of employees, probably more details about leases, more details about a freehold property if that's in there, more details about the type of customers and customer concentration, supplier concentration, some financials. I tend to keep the financials, detailed financials away, otherwise it can be quite a long document,
Mm.
and they are available if the buyer wants to see them. Hopefully now we've got their interest, and what we can then do is to have meetings with them because they're going to want to see the buyer. Incidentally, the confidential information memorandum is covered by what's called a non-disclosure agreement.
Mm.
So they have to sign that before they get access to the memorandum.
Yeah.
And then they probably want to have one or maybe two meetings with the sellers just to find out more. They can be quite intrusive meetings because they don't want to waste their time.
No.
They want to know, how much do you want for the business? Is it what you say it is in this memorandum? Because if it isn't, we're going to walk away. And are there any skeletons that we need to know about? Because if there are, you need, as the seller, to get them out quickly. And we'll come on to that
Yeah.
probably. So I think at that point, we would then ask for an initial offer. Let's assume that's acceptable. We then go to what's called heads of agreement, which is basically setting out what we're going to agree in the formal sale document.
Yeah.
That covers quite a bit of detail about the structure, more detail probably about the structure of the transaction, what the conditions are, restrictive covenants, costs, exclusivity, and time periods, and how due diligence is going to be conducted.
Mm.
At that point, everyone signs, very happy. The seller has lost a huge amount of momentum because the buyer now starts his due diligence. And unless we've got some form of control over that, in other words, regular reporting to make sure that everything's still on track, that they don't disappear for 3 weeks and we hear nothing, and then want to change the deal at the last minute. And at that point, normally the seller's solicitor, the seller's accountants will get involved in the due diligence because I don't know the detail of the business.
Mm. That's a really
And
interesting point. So, because, over my lifetime, due diligence has expanded from just financial to many other areas. Can you sort of expand a bit on that due diligence
yep, you're
aspect?
right. There's financial due diligence, legal due diligence. There's let's call it IP, intellectual property due diligence. There'll be due diligence on the property if there's a property there. Due, due diligence on the lease if there's a lease there. Is there sufficient amount set aside for dilapidations? There will be contractual things such as the contracts with suppliers,
Mm.
contracts with customers. Do they have things like change of control clauses in? I remember when we were looking at buying a coach company, that the clauses with the local authorities, say on the school run, said that if the business changes control, otherwise, in other words, as new shareholders, we reserve the right to renegotiate that contract. So that can be quite an awkward one to get round.
Mm.
Um, There's also something that you mentioned funders due diligence, Ian, and
Yeah.
from a banking point of view, when I've been buying businesses or helping managers in a management buyout, I've prepared detailed, let's say, 3-year forecasts. And what the bankers are looking to do essentially is look, is there enough headroom so that our covenants aren't affected? And they'll play around with those. I don't have to tell you. They'll play around with those and say, well, what happens if turnover goes down by 25%? What happens if wage bills go up by 10 or whatever?
Yeah.
So those would normally be prepared by the buyer. So they need to really understand the business to do that in order to present a viable case with a good set of assumptions to people like Barclays and your good selves. And finally, there's what I call vendor due diligence. And
Mm.
there's a note about this on my website, which essentially where the seller says, look, I know my business quite well, but I've got this management team that's been in place for a number of years. I've got a pretty good idea of what they do. They have authority to sign off expenses up to X. They have authority to undertake contracts up to Y. But I'm not entirely sure that what they're doing is 100% correct. You don't want the buyer to find that out. Now, I'm not saying that management will necessarily do that, but
Yeah.
like, for example, the change of control clause, the seller might not know of that.
Mm.
And if they undertake their own due diligence, all of these issues are going to come out. And if it's done, say, a year before sale or 2 years before sale, you've got time to sort them out. And if it is done, the providing the provider of the due diligence services is happy, there's no reason why that report can't go to the buyer.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it would say, look, you need to do this, this, and this. And then the seller can say, well, we've done this, this, and this. So we've accepted it was not good in that area, and we've now sorted it out.
Yeah.
Now, the self-assessment isn't necessarily going to go into it in that nitty-gritty detail. So it's another layer, if you like, of getting the business ready. And it also shows, I think, from the buyer's point of view, that you've been serious about doing this
Yeah.
some considerable time.
And I think that brings us on to my next question, my next point that's going through my head is that obviously if you can be as prepared as possible, you're probably going to reduce the costs overall because you're going to have less time, less queries, less everything. Yeah. But our listeners will be thinking, okay, I'm thinking about selling my business. I've got a 2 million turnover. I make 300,000, 400,000. I want a multiple of that, etc., etc. Are you able to give our listeners a bit of an idea around the cost range of a sale transaction that they could expect? It always used to be a percentage of
Yeah,
price,
it tended to be about 5, 6, 7% of the full sales value, didn't it?
Yeah,
I can't really speak for solicitors, but bear in mind you may have had a lot of costs getting to the point at which you market the business.
yeah,
So let's ignore those. Let's ignore those for the moment. Um, from my point, once I start marketing the business, then I break down my costs per so much for research, so much for the flyer, so much for the information memorandum, so much for the heads of agreement, etc., etc., etc. What I tend to do when we get to completion is to say, look, I will fix the fee, but if we don't complete, and I have done this day before completion, said to the client, forget it. This deal is not right. They've changed everything the last minute, blah, 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 blah.
mm,
And we pulled out the day before completion. We did sell about 2 months later to our second preferred buyer. So in that case, I charge a default fee. Now, I think if you take overall the solicitors, you're probably looking at excluding that on the basis of a share sale, which tends to be more complicated than an asset sale, where
mm.
the business sells its assets, the owner is left with the business that he or she has to wind up. You're probably looking at something in the region, and it's a bit of a broad range of
Yeah,
between
no,
30 and 50,000.
yeah, no, that doesn't surprise me. I'll be honest. There's there is a cost to selling the business at the end of the day, and you can't undervalue good professional advice at the end of the day, because if, like you say, if it all goes wrong at the death of it, then you still got your costs and
Yeah,
you still got your
yeah.
business, and you're
And
going nowhere.
and
So,
I do think telling a client to pull out is actually valuable.
and that's the integrity of someone like yourself. If you are already seeing a buyer that's messing them around, then you know, and it's not right, and they're fiddling and they're price chipping all the time and they're doing this, that, and the other, then tell them to walk away. That's it's easier to say yes than no.
It
So
is. But I think that's where, as I say, when you've signed the heads of agreement, the seller's probably lost a lot of control. But if we can get in there, that the buyer is going to report to us regularly that they found nothing. The deal is as it is. They don't want to change anything in the heads of agreement. And if that's done on a weekly basis, I know it puts pressure on them. At least we know. And if they then come back at the last minute, we can say, well, hang on, it's been fine for the last 6 weeks. Now you're telling us there's a problem. Surely you've tested all your assumptions in,
yeah,
you've prepared your projections for the bank.
yeah,
Why are you coming up with this now? Well,
yeah,
at least we've got a defense.
yeah. No, so I guess we're drawing towards the end of this podcast, and some really valuable insights there, Andrew. So if you could give one piece of advice to an entrepreneur, a seller, what might it be? I can guess a little bit from what we've talked about, but
Um, think of a stool. Think of a three-legged stool. If one of those legs falls away, the whole stool falls away. So I think for succession planning, however you do it, whether it be a trade sale, management buyout, or EOT, I think you've got to look at these three things. The first is, do I have enough money to retire in the manner that I want to do? Which probably means you need to talk to your IFA.
yeah,
Because if you've reached that point, why continue in business? Because you're risking what's if that's part of it, and we reckon we can get that without doing all the self-assessment, then why are you staying on? Why are you risking it? If that's 20% of what you need for your retirement, why are you risking that? So I think you need that understanding. IFAs have models. The second is, we've touched on it quite a bit, is the valuation.
mm,
Is the business going to develop the value you want to get your retirement funds if it's needed? And the third, and probably the most important, is, are you ready? Have you made up your mind? Because when I decided to leave the practice, the way I thought about it changed. And I think that's the key. If you have to put a succession plan in place, and you decided, I want out in 3 or 5 years' time, and I want this amount of money, so the business has got to be worth that. You've got that structure in place. So it's the three legs. All three, I think, have to be in harmony. Otherwise, the stool falls over.
no, that's great, Andrew. Thanks very much. And I guess with all that great advice and experience that you have, how do our listeners contact you? Can you
Um,
line
there's a
your
website
yeah?
called www.ascent, which is spelled ASSYNTCF.co.uk. There's this whole section on there about selling your business, and there's a whole list of blogs about various aspects, some of which we've touched on today, such as vendor due diligence. What am I selling, me or my business? My phone number is 07860 and my email address is awatkin@ascent, ASSYNT, CF.co.uk.
That's great. Thanks, Andrew. And I'm sure we can, when we put this podcast out on YouTube as well, then people can go over that again and jot your details down. But even if they go to your website, they'll have all the details they
They
need
will.
to get hold of you. So
Yeah.
I'll finish there with thanking you, Andrew, for your time today. It's been really insightful. I think you've answered a number of areas where clients of any business that would look to sell or are thinking about succession can actually come to you and get some advice. And I think that's great. And so I'd like to thank you, the listeners, for listening in. And we'll be posting this in all the various social media and on YouTube. As we know, Biz for Biz, we exist as a business to help business, and through thought leadership, through events, through awards, you will know about us. And please look out for the next podcast, which will be coming shortly. And we look forward to speaking and you listening to us again. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Ian, for the opportunity of talking to the listeners. And I hope that they've gained something from what I've said and realised that leaving it too late is really not an option. You've got to look at this early. And I'm not just saying that because I am what I am, but I've seen too many businesses that I have to look at and say, I'm sorry, you're not going to get anything like you expect.
Yeah, as they say, doing nothing is not an option.
I'm afraid so.
In this situation. Okay. Thank you
Thank
very
you,
much.
Ian.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Cheerio.